So I'm going to talk to you tonight about a unique, oh, we want to turn that off, that's okay, about a unique group of ceramic figurines that were made in Iran and Syria in the medieval Islamic period. But I'm going to start really just by giving you a bit of an idea of the context in which they were produced. So it's generally assumed that sculpture did not form part of Islamic artistic output. And in one sense, this is true. There's no tradition of making life-size portrait sculpture in the classical sense. Although the standing figure that is found at Kasr al-Gharbi, which is here, has been identified as a portrait of its builder, the Umayyad Caliph al-Walid II. And elsewhere in the palace, there are numerous items of sculpture made of plaster. And other Umayyad palaces, such as Hirbat al-Mafja and Mashata, also have examples of similar statuary. But this is a fairly much of a one-off. We don't. And why didn't the idea of sculpture catch on? Well, clearly religious disapproval must have played a part. And over time, the theological establishment formulated strict objections to three-dimensional images of all kinds, even going so far as to ban toys. And we've got records in HISPA manuals, which guided the practice of market inspectors. And these denounced the selling of toy animals, which were given to children on festival days. However, the surviving material evidence suggests that these regulations were regularly flouted, and never more so than in the period from the mid-12th to mid-13th century, when all types of three-dimensional figures and objects became fashionable. And it is from this period that we've got evidence of all kinds of sculpture. Some of the most impressive are up on the screen. We've got these life-size, painted stucco sculptures, and they're wearing very lavish costumes and bearing arms. You can see the swords here. They weren't carved in the round. They were essentially only half round, and the back is a flat surface. So none of them have been discovered in situ, but it suggested that they were positioned around the walls of the palace throne room, and they represented members of the guard, or indeed even possibly members of the ruling family. Of a more popular nature, and I think you'll recognize these two pieces, which are in the collection here, were animals, bronze animals, cut out and often inlaid with copper and silver. And they served different functions. Some were made as incense burners, and they've got the piercing so that the smoke from the incense would be released into the atmosphere. And they were shaped as felines, possibly the lynx, or here a peacock or a bird. Other smaller objects, such as this, this has a cavity in the base of it, and it's been suggested that this would have been filled with lead or some heavy material, and this would have been placed on the corners of a carpet to stop the corners from rolling up. So one final piece of metal sculpture. This is a unique piece in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, which is made as a cow suckling its calf, and this lion is attacking the cow and chewing on its hump. And it would have been filled, it was a vessel which was filled here through the lion's head, and then there's a spout out through the cow's mouth. And an inscription on the body indicates how proud the craftsmen were of this particular piece of casting. And it reads, "This cow, calf, and lion were cast in one piece with the assistance of God." And then it names the patron, the designer, and the caster. And it gives a date which equates to August-September 1206. This type of information is very rare, which actually designates where and when it was made. But it's not unique in the ceramic objects of this period. We have a great number of ceramic objects which are signed and dated, and the greatest concentration falls in the period between 1180 and 1220. Although only one of the ceramic figurines that I'm going to show you is actually dated, and its date is something of an anomaly, the style and decoration of many of the objects compare with dated pieces. And this has allowed me to suggest a chronology and a dating sequence for their production. So first of all, I'd like to describe to you where and when they were made. The main production center for ceramics in this period, in which all three of these pieces were made, was Kashan in central Iran. There are very few records of the city's industrial history before this time, but by the 12th century, it had become preeminent in ceramics production. And the Arabic and Persian words for tiles and pottery are kashi or kashani. And it seems that ceramics manufacture had become so closely identified with the town that the product was then named after it. And a considerable number of signed and dated pieces, of which I've given you 3 on the screen, survive, and they name the city, and therefore it's possible to establish some kind of chronology of production from there. A second production center, which was almost contemporary, was Raqqa in Syria. Unfortunately, Raqqa craftsmen did not sign and date their pieces. And in the past, there's been a tendency to attribute all of certain types of ware to Iran, to Kashan production. But actually, sculptural figurines have certainly in the past fallen into this category where they were always unequivocally assigned to a Persian production. But actually, I think analysis of the iconographic and decorative details reveals that a large number of them should be reallocated to Syria, and I'll be able to show you some later on. So let's have a look at a ceramic figurine. I've kept you waiting for far too long. They were made in an incredible, different, wide range of shapes. We've got animals such as camels, birds, lions, this cow which has a vase on the back. They were also made as human figures. The figures range widely in the quality of their manufacture, in the size and in the type of glaze, which suggests to me that they appeal to a broad spectrum of society and were made at different qualities to suit different price ranges. So this piece here is nearly 50 centimeters high. It's an enormous piece. It's made of lots of different elements. You can see we've got the animal on the base, but we've also got this vase on the back and these figures that look as if they're holding up the vase. It's a lengthy piece to have made. All of these different pieces had to be made separately and then connected together. So this would have been a very expensive piece. And by contrast, these pieces, which are just painted in black under a transparent turquoise glaze, were probably simpler and less expensive. One of the triggers for this extensive new ceramics industry in Kashan seems to have been the development of a composite body material, which we now describe as stone paste or fritware. And the Persian author, Abul Qasim Kashani, he actually lists the ingredients for this material, and he says it was made of 10 parts of quartz, 1 part of frit, which is ground glass, and 1 part of a fine white clay. And what they achieved was the best imitation of Chinese porcelain. It was the best that Islamic potters had yet succeeded in producing. But the small amount of clay in this body made it much less malleable and plastic and flexible than earthenware had been, and therefore the potters had to discover new ways of making it into shapes. A vessel made out of stone paste needed to be made out of several different elements and then put together. It was these restrictions that encouraged the potters to refine molding and casting techniques, and they become very expert in these in this period. And this had the effect of expanding the repertoire of vessel shapes primarily, so you get a lot of pottery shapes imitating metal in this period. But it has a further aspect, which is very important in terms of the figurines, is that three-dimensional objects are an obvious progression if you're working with this stone paste and casting in molds. So the production of making figurines involves several different stages. First of all, the potters had to make a master model. We have very few of these that survive, and I've never seen one for one of the figurines. So instead, I've chosen to put on the screen. This one is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and it would have made something like this, a sort of bowl in the shape of a harpy, and you can see the head here and probably the sort of bird-like tail. This was the master model. From this, you make your mold. So this is what you end up, something like this. And it is into this mold that the stone paste would be rolled out, if you think of rolling pastry, and then a layer of this would be pressed into the mold, and any decoration that was in the mold would then impress itself onto the ceramic. And so a piece like this cow figure, would have been made, the body would have been made in one mold, the head in a separate mold, and various elements such as the legs and the tubular spout and the horns would have all have been hand-rolled. All of these elements would then have been stuck together with liquid clay, and then it would have been fired. So this piece is a piece in the Keir collection in London, and it's an extraordinary piece because it's very complicated. It's made of very many different elements, as you can see. It's got a human figure riding on the back of the cow. It's got a sort of snake-like tail. And a disaster happened in this. So this luster is a very complicated technique that requires 2 firings. Disaster struck in this piece. So the original is made. It's been decorated with a blue glaze, and it's been fired a first time. And then the second firing, before you apply the luster and then you have to give it a second firing. Well, what's happened in the second firing, can you see here? This is the chest cavity. The two halves of the mold have separated out. So the two halves of the piece have separated out and have split it open effectively. Well, this object formed part of a hoard of ceramics that was found in Gurgan. They were all carefully packed into jars for safekeeping, probably buried or hidden by a trader anxious to protect his stock from the advancing Mongol armies. And it shows that such a piece, even though it was damaged, effectively ruined, because you could no longer use this as a vessel if it's got a great split in the front of it, was still saleable as a second, presumably as a sort of artistic piece. About a third of the sculptures are decorated with luster, and this has allowed me to suggest a chronology for their production. Some years ago, Dr. Oliver Watson analysed the dated pieces known to him, and he established a very well understood chronological framework, which is based on groups of elements within three sequential styles, and he described these as the monumental, the miniature, and the Kashan styles. Subsequently, another scholar called Dr. Robert Mason compiled a more nuanced typology of motifs and forms, and this he thought could be applied to the analysis of luster wares, and he identified 11 different groups which he dated from 1100 to 1340. Now, approximately 1/4 of the figurines and sculptures that I examined, that's 97 objects approximately, are decorated with luster. So I used particularly Mason's analysis of motifs in order to judge all these pieces and to analyze them. And in the end, I concluded that they were all made within the very earliest phases of production in Kashan, and that would be between around 1150 and 1200. So I'll talk about these. I just wanted to show you these three pieces, and I'll probably talk about them a little bit later on. So with 450 figures known to me, this evening I'm only going to be able to show you a selection. And I've chosen to focus on the human figurine, the human figures, which allow us a very close glimpse at the inhabitants of this period in terms of their costume, their hairstyle, and their jewelry. And most interesting and unusual are a group of figures made in the form of women with a baby suckling at the breast. This is one of the very best examples. It's in the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. She's a large and skillfully potted hollow figure of a woman nursing a child. There she is holding the child. The figure is open at the top, as you can see, and glazed on the interior, which suggests that the object was used as a container, and the point of the headdress acted as a pouring lip. So you can imagine having liquid in here and pouring it out, and that would act as the lip. The potter attempted quite successfully to keep the areas of flesh on both the woman and the child white, while the headdress and garment were coloured this pale cobalt blue. The moulding of the areas in relief, such as the child, are only partly accurate. So you can see that the infant's legs end here. So he's moulded until here, and then his legs completely seem to disappear. And you can also see that the covered breast, although it's outlined, is flat, whereas the exposed breast is rounded. The child raises its hand to guide the breast into its mouth, which is a very realistic and charming gesture. And it's clearly not a newborn baby. You can see from its features and the length of its hair that it's an infant several years old. And the mother wears an open coat with a large buckle over a shift underneath from which her breast protrudes. Her hair hangs down. She's got these long tresses. You can also see that at the back, it's tied into it with a decorative element which hangs down at the bottom. She wears this crown-shaped headdress with pearls around the base, and you can just see a little crescent of fringe just above her hair. Some of this has been repainted, so in fact this section is not particularly accurate. We can't actually, but we can tell from some other pieces that I'm going to show you in a second. In fact, now, these two heads here show you what the head would probably have looked like. And you can see that they've all got tattoos in the center of the forehead. So this eyebrows that almost join in the center with a tattoo, and then more tattoos in the center of the cheek. Altogether, I have documented 17 breastfeeding women figures of differing sizes, with different glazes and at different levels of quality. The luster glazed ones, such as the one you've seen here, are the most carefully decorated, as you'd expect from such an expensive technique. So the Berlin figure is large and superbly decorated. You can see it's 36 centimeters high, whereas other examples are smaller and more cursorily decorated. So these ones are all around 19, 20 centimeters high. A group of 5, of which 3 are on the screen here, are so similar in appearance and in size that I suggest they were probably produced from the same mold. And this one in the Cincinnati Museum, you can see how it's decorated in such a quick and slapdash way that you can barely see the child, although it is molded. When you handle it, you can see it's molded in relief. So the decoration actually covers the full extent of the child and the woman, with no separation, no distinction between them. But whatever their overall quality, the female figures all share certain characteristics. They were all formed in a mold, which dictated a consistency of their shape, and it's only the details of their costume and the jewelry that varied according to the potter's imagination. They all sit cross-legged, and they cradle the child in both arms, with both arms supporting the body. So the head is in the crook of the elbow, and the feet supported by the other hand. And they're all hollow. They all generally have a triangular lip. This piece maybe was damaged. More or less contemporary with production in Kashan, the second production center at Raqqa. And these two figures were probably made there. Although similar in several respects to the luster-glazed example in Berlin, they're also subtly different. They both wear a slightly different headdress, and you can see that around the chin, it's fastened by this chain here, which you can see here, and also here. And this is different. The one in Berlin doesn't have that type of arrangement. They also have these rather curious projecting elements attached to the headdress. A similar type of headdress, certainly with a chain, you can just see here under the chin, is illustrated in this page from the Maqamat manuscript, which was made circa 1220 to 1240, probably in Syria. And the other curious thing is that on these Syrian-made examples, the child suckles on the breast from the different side. And this is a completely inexplicable development to me. In the majority of depictions of nursing women, for instance, of Mary and Jesus, or any depictions of a woman nursing a child, the child was generally held in the mother's left arm, feeding from the breast that's nearest to the heart. This image is so unusual that it would appear that these figurines, all of which served as vessels, must have had a very specific function related to the image they portrayed. In the pre-modern age, pregnancy and childbirth were fraught with danger and uncertainty, and women sought all manner of amulets and talismans to assist and preserve them. So drinking from a vessel in the form of a nursing woman may well have been considered a protective measure to ensure a good supply of breast milk and the health of the mother and child. And breast milk was more than just the perfect baby food. It was also believed to cure other ailments, such as ophthalmia, and to have even other therapeutic qualities. There is one 12th century Persian cosmography which refers to a statue of a woman with large breasts which was carved out of a rock, and which this statue miraculously secreted milk, and sick people were taken there to be cured. So other types of figurines included musicians, drinkers, various attendants, the type of occupations enjoyed within a palace or elite environment. Several of the musicians, such as these two in the center, are identifiable as women. So here we've got one playing the harp and one playing the tambourine. The singing girls who accompanied herself with a lute or a tambourine was often featured in the stories of the Maqamat and the Alf Layla wa Layla, and was depicted in illustrated manuscripts. So the tambourine player is holding a circular instrument against her left shoulder, and she taps it rhythmically with her right hand. This instrument is known as a tar, and was made with a layer of goat or sheepskin, which was strung tightly onto a wooden frame with metal rings attached to the interior face. Beside her, this musician is shown holding a harp that's got a curved wooden sound box, and both hands are strumming the strings. Both women, like the breastfeeding women, are shown sitting cross-legged and wearing exactly the same type of costume. So you can see this here is not pointed, it's straight across, but it's the similar type of design to the other headdresses you've seen. This is an extraordinary and unique musician. He's standing, and he appears to be male, and he's holding here under one arm an instrument that's slightly damaged, so it's difficult exactly to identify it. But it could be either a duff, which was a variant of the tambourine, which had a membrane on both sides, or a goblet-shaped drum, which was tapped on the membrane. His facial features include a wide, thick-lipped mouth and a wide-spreading nose, and they seem to identify him as a black African. On the other side, this figure, which is in your collection here in Kuwait, is of a kneeling figure, and he's proffering with under one arm this object. This was a leather pouch made from animal skin from which kumis was served. It was both made and served, in fact. And kumis was an alcoholic drink generally made from fermented mare's milk, which was drunk by the tribesmen of the Central Asian steppes. And leather was the ideal receptacle for freshly made kumis because it stretched to accommodate the expansion of the fermenting liquid, and its moldable form made it suitable for transport on horseback. A very specific type of attendant, of which there are several examples in Luster, is this standing figure. He stands, he's wearing a conical hat, he's holding a stick, one hand over the other, and he's got an opening, as you can see in the top. It's a vessel with an opening in it, or rather a narrow opening. The figure can be identified as the Hajib, a type of guard under the jurisdiction of the Amir Hajib, the chamberlain and head of palace security who controlled the access of visitors to the ruler. He appears frequently in Ottoman manuscripts, and you see him here on a page from the Suleiman-Name. This is a tiny detail from the page. And he's guarding one of the inner entrances to the Topkapi Palace. And you can see he's wearing a tall hat, holding the stick. So he's very analogous to this ceramic figurine. However, we also have examples of the contemporary. This obviously, the Suleiman-Name is from the 16th century. This is a contemporary box. It's got a date, which is 1196 to 7. It's got a combination lock on it. It's obviously a strong box, and therefore they want to give the indication of it being guarded by these little figures here, these three figures. Although they're flat, each of them stand in exactly this position, and they've got one hand over the other. They no longer have the weapon's been lost, but I'm absolutely certain that they'd been holding this type of stick. And now that we have a series of tiles, such as this one here in Cairo, which give us an indication of how the Hajib figurines might have been displayed. So these tiles were molded with a central seated figure, and they're flanked on either side by the standing figure, just like the figure here. This type of tile with this very characteristic lobed arch is generally identified with the tile decoration of Takhti Suleiman, the Ilkhanid summer palace that was built by Abaka Khan. And luster tiles excavated from the site are inscribed with dates ranging from 1271 to 1276, which is actually later than the production date of most of these figurines. But that suggests to me that the display of individual figurines had fallen out of favor by the Ilkhanid period. And this fragmentary tile here shows exactly the same. Would have had the central seated figure, the Hajib here. Now, interestingly, in this top register here, we've got a harpist and a drinker. And this gave me the idea of how this type of figurine might have been displayed, because of course we have no idea, as we've only got the separate figurines left, we can't tell. But if they were to have been displayed, say on a banqueting table, in these kind of arrangements, so you've got the drinker flanked by the Hajib with the harpist, and basically I've recreated here exactly the sort of same tableau that we've got there. The largest group of figurines are made of human form, are depicted on horseback. The Seljuks were, of course, a nomadic people and before the conquest of the Islamic territories, and they remained entirely dependent on their horses, and the image of the horseman is ubiquitous in this period. These three images on the screen show members of the ruling elite holding a falcon, as in this piece here and here. So obviously this is a frontispiece from manuscript, and here we have a bull. Or here we've got a horseman, a hunter, and here he's got this little tiny figure, which is probably a cheetah. The back of his headdress, just like the other figurines you saw, is cut away, and he would have acted as a vessel. Hunting with cheetahs was always the preserve of royalty. The earliest evidence of tame cheetahs is found on pharaonic reliefs, and the hunting of wild game on horseback with cheetahs to attack and capture the prey was enthusiastically pursued by Islamic rulers, particularly those like the Seljuks, who were happiest in the saddle. A 17th century account of the hunt describes how the horseman carried the cheetah chained and hooded behind him, and when the prey was close, he pulled off the hood and released the feline, which leapt from the horse with a shriek to attack the prey. In most respects, the figurines are closely comparable to the images of horsemen depicted on contemporary ceramics and inlaid metalwork, as you can see here. But the forming of a three-dimensional image, a three-dimensional figure in clay, imposed certain limitations on the complexity of the pose that could be achieved by the potter. So if a three-dimensional depiction, the horse had to be shown with straight legs, whereas, of course, in any other depiction, the horse was always depicted in motion, its legs in motion. These same technical limitations prevented the addition of projecting elements. So you couldn't really have a horseman with a falcon. It would have broken or cracked in the firing. It was too difficult. So this figure of the cheetah is, stuck onto the back, where it had better chances of surviving the firing. Nevertheless, it is clear that the potters were familiar with the correct arrangement of the equipment and the harness, even if they were restricted in the way they could display it. The majority of horseman figures were not made as containers like this one, but were in fact made as just decorative figures. This is another container, but these are just plain decorative figures. And they carry a quiver, sometimes, a shield, various bits of armor. Like all the figurines, it's possible to identify at least two levels of quality, so that we've got a carefully painted underglazed example, and this, which is much, much smaller, as you can see, half the size of this piece, and just got a single color glaze. The warrior on the right, this one here, carries a sword which he rests on his shoulder, and has a shield behind him. You can just see the outline of it there. Both horse and rider have painted facial features. The legs of the horse are molded, so you can actually see all the hock and the fetlock of the horse. But this one is recognizably of the same type, but half the size. The horse, although it's fairly schematically rendered, is nevertheless recognizable as the type of small mountain pony favored by the Seljuks for their speed and stamina. Proportions were not carefully observed, as you can see, and on some figures, in fact on most figures, the horseman was very large relative to the horse. They're shown in detail from the waist up, but what you can see here is that the legs of this horseman are they're not molded at all. He almost looks like a centaur sort of rising from the back of the horse. This sculpture of a kneeling man is most unusual for its size and its appearance. There's another one, which is a twin to this one, which is in a private Turkish collection. This piece is in the Khalili collection in London. The glazing of the statue, which has no openings, it's just a statue, was incredibly fine, and the work of a highly skilled artist with a very delicate touch in rendering all the details. So he's left the skin, the creamy white of the stone paste, and also the face, the hands here as well, so you can see the flesh tones. Whereas the garments were glazed turquoise and cobalt. The painting of the figure shows the work of a highly skilled artist. The face is long, you can see he's got high cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes. The nose is in relief, and the nostrils are carefully delineated. The long hairs of the beard and moustache are individually visible, as are the short hairs at the nape of the neck, and the faint shadow of beard growth below the cheekbones. The figure wears a turquoise kaba, patterned with leafy spirals, which you can see here, a pale blue cloak over it, which just hangs from his shoulders, draped over his shoulders, and a pale scarf here, which falls in elegant folds around the neck. And on his head, he wears a conical hat, and interestingly, there's an inscription around it. Now, the inscription is complicated. It names our Lord Tuhrul, the Sultan, the Learned, the Just, and then it gives this year, 38,500, which would equate to 1143. Now, this inscription, while apparently identifying the subject of the sculpture and the date of production, is very problematic. The sequencing of the numbers is unusual, and the date cannot refer to the manufacturing date of the piece, because we know that this style of ceramic wasn't produced until around 1200, and nor does the rule of any Seljuk sultans that we know of coincide with the date 1143. So Michael Rogers, who studied this piece, in order to explain this disjunction between the inscription and when the piece was actually made, suggested that this object was made as a monumental chess piece to commemorate the fierce struggle in which the brothers Masoud and Tuhrul participated to establish their succession. As the date of 1143 falls within the date of the victor, Masoud, he suggested this piece was the surviving remnant of a chess set in which the two brothers were depicted as the opposing kings. Well, in ceramic terms, this is a difficult argument to agree with. First of all, because there's absolutely no evidence that the underglaze painted technique had been developed in Kashan by 1143. This was the beginning of production, and we don't have any evidence of production, of underglaze production, until around 1200. Only if the numbers of the date were transposed, an error which seems very hard to believe in a piece of this quality, and the intended date was 1187, in which case you wouldn't have 538, you had 583, and that would equate to 1187. Well, that's closer to 1200 when we know of the production of underglaze wares. It has to be said also that the date 583 would then also equate with the regnal period of the last Seljuk Sultan, who was called Tuhril III. So then actually the name Tuhril would apply. And he reigned from 1176 to 94. But the other thing that's curious about this piece is the kneeling stance, which is very unusual. All of the figures that I've shown you so far have been cross-legged. And also the apparel. This particular turquoise kaba, this scarf, this hat, they all resemble the costume and tall hat of a Sufi mystic, the khirka and the kalansawa. And according to Sufi manuals of Sufi practice, the color of the khirka indicated the Sufi's degree of spiritual advancement. So a turquoise robe could only be worn by a mystic who had reached the high stage of his spiritual journey. And the cloak and the scarf, worn in imitation of the Prophet Muhammad, were further indications of this elevated level. So that's the end of my look at human figurines. We're just now going to look at some animals. There are numerous figurines made in a wide variety of animal and bird forms, a veritable menagerie, in fact. Like all the figurines we've looked at so far, they vary in their complexity and the quality of manufacture, and they were made, again, both as vessels and as decorative objects with no apparent function. So this elephant in the center, it carries a palanquin with musicians inside, and it's got the mahout here. So this is a very highly complex piece, which would have been made with lots of separate sections and all connected up together, joined together, whereas these other pieces are just made in a two-part mold and underglaze painted or just with a single color. The largest group are in the form of bulls, and their production can be attributed solely to Kashan. These bull figurines have a very abstracted form, such as this one. They were made as vessels with a filler spout in the back, so you can see that's where the liquid would have been filled through here, and then an opening spout for pouring from the mouth. Bull-shaped vessels had a very long history in Iran, where they formed part of cult ritual. In the earliest phases of the Zoroastrian religion, a ritual sacrifice of the bull took place, but eventually this actual sacrifice of the bull was replaced by the offering of libations in bull-shaped vessels, such as the one that you see here on the screen. The symbolism of the bull seems to have remained ingrained within Iranian culture even after conversion to Islam. And research by the scholar Suren Melikian-Shivani has found that these bull-shaped vessels were used to contain wine in a ritual celebration of the dawning of Nowruz, a festival which had strong links to ancient Zoroastrian practice. An 11th century Persian lexicography refers to the takuk gavi, which the author defines as a bull-shaped vessel made from ceramic, gold, or other material, which was used as a wine vessel. Like the bull, the lion had powerful associations. The beast, with its yellow color, its ferocity, and its mane, which encircled the head like solar rays, became identified with the sun, and eventually in the zodiac, it represented the season when the sun was at its maximum strength. Now, one definition of the takuk mentioned that the vessel could also be made in the form of a lion, which suggests that lion and bull vessels may have been designed as pairs, and some of them you can actually tell they were decorated in a very similar way. And this reflected the astrological conjunction of the constellations of Leo and Taurus, which ushered in Nowruz, the very period in which this particular type of ritual drinking was supposed to take place. Now, these lion figures tend to be very small, and they fitted really into the palm of one hand. They only have one spout, so they don't tend to have an opening through the mouth. They only have one spout, which made them very impractical for any kind of use, which again confirms that they would have been used as for ceremonial usage rather than any kind of practical function. The production of ceramic sculpture appears to have been a fashion initiated and pursued within the cultural milieu of Seljuk society within its widest possible sense, encompassing the regime in Iran as well as its successor dynasties in Syria, further west in Syria, in the Jazeera and in Anatolia. But what was the market for these figures? In other words, who was buying them? The subject matter of the figurines includes many familiar themes associated with the palace, but images of breastfeeding women and animals such as the bull and the cockerel are not so familiar in contemporary iconography and seem intended for a much broader cross-section of the population than just the palace elite. The quality of many of the figurines, with their simple glazes and cursory decoration, suggests that, like much contemporary tableware, they were intended for the middle rather than luxury section of the market. A very rare, in fact, a unique textual reference by the Ayyubid historian Sibt ibn al-Jawzi describes how al-Khawaz, or jug maker, responded to the sight of a fat Ayyubid prince entering Baghdad by producing pottery caricatures of this prince, of him on horseback. So figures, horsemen, such as the ones that I was showing you earlier. And this anecdote seems to me to be indicative of the popular market who were attracted to this type of figurine, not the ruling elite who would have been appalled by this type of mockery, but the middle classes who were enjoying poking fun at their overlords. And as you've seen, the figurines were made, the sculptures were made both as functional objects, generally in the form of vessels with openings or spouts, like you've seen here, for instance, or here, from which liquid could be poured, but also statuettes with a purely decorative value. So this is a piece which is entirely, it's integral, it doesn't have any openings. Leaving to one side those objects which had a specific function, which I haven't actually shown you any, but there are pieces of furniture. This would probably have been a vase, fountain heads, or obvious vessels such as cups, such as the harpy-shaped cup, which I showed you at the beginning. The numbers of the remaining two groups, figures with spouts or figures without, are quite evenly divided. In the past, anthropomorphic pieces, vessels, were described as aquamaniles, and that comes from the two Latin words aqua for water and mani for hands. And there were, this suggests, they were thought to be intended to be for hand washing, vessels for hand washing. But the majority of vessels that I've shown you are much too small to contain water for hand washing. Their scale suggests that they contain liquids for drinking. In the case of the breastfeeding women, analogy with certain ancient vessels indicates that the liquid contained may have been human breast milk or perhaps animal milk, which acquired certain curative powers from the particular form of the vessel. But in many other cases, it appears that the vessels were made to hold wine. I referred to the textual references to the Takuk very briefly, but there are several other poetic verses. I showed you one on the screen, which I didn't refer to. But there are several poetic verses which refer to this vessel unequivocally as a wine container, particularly by a Persian poet called Khagani, a 12th century poet from Shirwan. And in his verses, an object on occasion referred to precisely as gav-i safalin, that is, pottery bull, was used in a wine-drinking ritual performed at dawn on the first day of the new year by the ruler and his entourage. Well, the identification of this object with the surviving pottery bulls is given, and I'll just take you back so you can see what I'm talking about, one of these, for instance, is given added weight by the fact that he was writing precisely in the period in which such objects were being produced in Kashan. Paradoxically, the surviving objects are demonstrably not of royal quality. But for the piece I showed you right at the beginning, the 1204, that extraordinary metal piece with the cow and calf, now that might have been a royal quality, it was inlaid with silver, but a lot of these ceramic pieces, the plain turquoise glazed ones, clearly aren't. And from that, I think we can extrapolate that this ritual was not confined to the elite, but had a much wider diffusion amongst the rest of society. So what happened to these figurines? Well, the trend for them, the fashion for them seems to have ended almost as soon as it began. On the eastern and western sides of the central Islamic world, the Khanids and the Mamluks inherited an artistic tradition characterized by the diversity of its figurative imagery. But within a generation or two, this had been replaced by a completely different aesthetic. Ceramic sculpture as an art form patronized by the middle classes might have been expected to continue enjoying a popular appeal, particularly if it was associated with an annually occurring festival such as Nowruz. However, artistic trends inevitably followed the lead set by the court, and it seems that the fashion for such objects had played itself out. A decline in patronage inevitably leads to a decline in technical expertise. And the potters of Kashan and Raqqa had risen to the challenge of producing sculptural objects in response to the enthusiastic demands of the marketplace and to show off their own abilities and virtuosity. But when demand fell away, the technical knowledge was quickly lost or forgotten, and they stopped being made. Thank you.